Without them, Aristotle might have been lost forever without them. The Islamic Golden Age could not have happened without them. Europe might never have rediscovered. Greek philosophy, they were not Greeks, they were not Arabs. They were Syriac Christians, and they were the invisible bridge across which the entire intellectual heritage of antiquity passed from one civilization to the next. W were the Syriacs? The Syriac people are one of the most consequential and least known communities in the history of human civilization. They spoke Aramaic, the language of Jesus of Nazareth, the everyday language of the ancient Near East, the lingua franca of the region for 1,000 years before the Arabic conquest. Their Christian tradition stretched back, by their own account, to the apostles themselves, and their intellectual tradition, their capacity to translate, preserve, transmit, and transform knowledge from one civilization to another, shaped the intellectual history of the world in ways that most people have never been taught to understand who the Syriacs were. We must first understand their historical position. They lived in the territories between the great empires, between Byzantium in the west and Persia in the east, between the Greek world and the Arab world, between the ancient Mediterranean and the vast heartland of Asia. This position was politically precarious. They were often caught between larger powers, subjects without armies of their own, minorities under whoever ruled the land. But intellectually, this position was extraordinary. They spoke multiple languages. They moved between multiple cultural worlds. They were translators not just of texts, but of entire civilizations in this journey. We have used advanced artificial intelligence techniques to reconstruct the ancient monasteries, translation houses, and intellectual communities where Syriac scholars did their world historical work. You will not just hear this history, you will witness it. Theological identity, the Council of Chalcedon and its Sionisicians. Syriac story is inseparable from one of the most consequential theological arguments in the history of Christianity. The question of the nature of Jesus. Christ. Was Christ one person with two natures, divine and human, as the Council of Chalcedon declared in 451 AD? Or was this formulation wrong? The Council of Chalcedon was politically as much as theologically motivated. The Western churches, Rome and Constantinople, needed a doctrinal statement that would consolidate their authority against the powerful Eastern churches of Alexandria and Antioch. The Council's decisions pleased the West, but the Eastern Christian communities, Egyptians, Armenians, Ethiopians, and above all Syriacs, rejected them. For the next 2 centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Christian communities were locked in a bitter, sometimes violent theological conflict. This conflict had devastating consequences for the Eastern Christians. They were marginalized, persecuted, and excluded from power within the empire they nominally belonged to. But it also had an extraordinary consequence. It pushed the Syriac intellectual tradition eastward, into Persia, with the Sasanian Empire, happy to support Christians who were enemies of Byzantium, provided relative tolerance and even protection. And it was in this Eastern diaspora that the Syriac intellectual tradition reached its greatest height. Great schools, Edessa and Anisai Beis. The center of Syriac intellectual life was the School of Edessa, today Urfa, in southeastern Turkey. Founded in the 4th century, the School of Edessa was one of the most important centers of learning in the ancient world. It was here that the works of Greek philosophy and theology were first translated into Syriac, that Aristotelian logic was systematically studied, that the texts of Greek medicine were rendered into a language accessible to the wider Eastern world. When the Byzantine Emperor Zeno closed the School of Edessa in 489 AD because its scholars were associated with the Nestorian theology, he had condemned. The scholars did not disappear. They crossed the border into Persian territory. and founded a new school at Nisibis today, Nusaybin. On the Turkish-Syrian border, the School of Nisibis became the greatest intellectual institution of the Syriac world, and one of the greatest in the late antique world. It had a systematic curriculum, a residential community of scholars, a library, and an intellectual tradition of extraordinary depth. What were they studying and teaching? Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle's logical works, his categories, his on interpretation, his prior and posterior analytics. Greek medicine, especially Galen and Hippocrates. Greek theology, especially the great Cappadocian Fathers. And they were not just studying these texts, they were translating them, commenting on them, arguing about them, and transmitting them eastward along the Silk Road to India and China, and eventually southward into the Arab world, where they would change history. The translation movement, how knowledge was SAV. Greatest contribution of the Syriac intellectual tradition to world history was the translation movement, beginning in the 5th century and reaching its peak in the 7th and 8th centuries. Syriac scholars translated the major works of Greek philosophy, science, and medicine into Syriac, preserving them at a moment when the political chaos of the late Roman Empire was destroying the institutional supports for Greek learning in the Western world. The names of these translators are largely unknown today, even to specialists, but their work was of incalculable importance. Sergius of Rishona translated Galen's medical treatises into Syriac. In the 6th century, Jacob of Edessa translated and commented on Greek philosophy. In the 7th century, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Syriac Christian who worked in the court of the Abbasid caliphs, was perhaps the greatest translator in world history, responsible for rendering into Arabic and Syriac more texts of Greek philosophy and medicine than any other single individual. Hunayn ibn Ishaq's translation methods were extraordinarily rigorous. He did not translate word by word. He sought multiple manuscripts of each Greek text, compared them, corrected errors, and then rendered the content into clear, precise Arabic when he encountered terms for which no Arabic equivalent existed. He coined new words, the technical vocabulary of Arabic, philosophy and medicine words that are still used in every language that has borrowed from Arabic is largely his creation, and the texts he translated included the complete works of Galen, major works of Hippocrates, Aristotle's logical treatises, and dozens of other Greek scientific and philosophical texts. Daichi Syriac contribution to the Islamic Golden Age, the Islamic Golden Age, that extraordinary explosion of scientific, philosophical, and cultural achievement that occurred in the Abbasid Caliphate between the 8th and 13th centuries, was not created from nothing. It was built on a foundation of translated knowledge, and most of that translated knowledge passed through Syriac hands. When the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded Baghdad in 762 AD, he inherited a tradition of intellectual patronage that the Sasanian Persians had developed partly through their engagement with Syriac scholars. His grandson Harun al-Rashid, and especially his great-grandson Ulman, developed this tradition into the famous House of Wisdom Beit al-Hikmah, the great translation and research institution of the Abbasid court, who were the translators at the House of Wisdom. Overwhelmingly, they were Syriac Christians. The great families of Syriac scholars, the Buktushu family, the physicians who served the caliphs for generation after generation, the Hunayn family, whose translation work covered philosophy and medicine across decades. These were the human bridges across which Greek knowledge passed into Arabic. Without them, Al-Kindi could not have developed Arabic philosophy. Al-Farabi could not have systematized Aristotelian thought. Avicenna could not have written his canon of medicine, the text that dominated medical education in both the Islamic world and Europe for 6 centuries. And without the Islamic Golden Age, built on this Syriac transmitted Greek knowledge, the The European Renaissance could not have happened the Greek. Texts that European scholars rediscovered in the 12th and 13th centuries, changing the intellectual life of the continent forever, came largely from Arabic translations that had themselves been made from Syriac translations of Greek originals. The chain of transmission runs Greek to Syriac, to Arabic, to Latin, to European vernacular. The Syriac link is essential. Without it, the chain breaks. The Syriac literary Tiradia and beyond, their role as transmitters of Greek knowledge. The Syriacs developed a rich literary tradition of their own. Ephraim, the Syrian writing in the 4th century, is considered one of the greatest poets in any language of the ancient world. His hymns and verse homilies, melodies, were the primary medium of Syriac theology for centuries. He wrote about the nature of Christ, the fall of Adam, the role of women in salvation history, the meaning of death and resurrection, and he wrote with a richness of imagery, a playfulness of paradox, and a depth of feeling that has no parallel in the Greek theological tradition of his time. Syriac historical tradition is also remarkable. Michael the Syrian, patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church in the 12th century, wrote a chronicle that covers world history from the creation to his own time, one of the most comprehensive historical works of the Middle Ages. Bar Hebraeus Gregorios. Abul Faraj, a 13th century Syriac polymath, wrote on philosophy, history, medicine, grammar, poetry, and theology with a range that recalls the greatest figures of the Islamic Golden Age, because he was, in his own way, part of that tradition. Syriac communities, Todaic-speaking Christian communities of the Middle East, are today among the most endangered peoples on earth. After centuries of slow decline through massacres, forced migrations, and cultural assimilation, the 20th and 21st centuries brought catastrophe. The Saipho, the Syriac genocide of 19,141,918, carried out alongside the Armenian genocide, killed hundreds of thousands of Syriac Christians in the decades since. Waves of emigration have emptied the ancient communities of Mesopotamia, Syria, and southeastern Turkey. The Iraqi Christian community, many of them Syriac, numbered over 1 million in 2003. Today, fewer than 300,000 remain, and yet the Syriac language survives. Aramaic, the language of Jesus, the language of Daniel and Ezra in the Hebrew Bible, the language that was once spoken from Egypt to India, still lives in Syriac liturgy. In the dialects of the small communities scattered from the Tur Abdin Mountains to the suburbs of Chicago and Stockholm, the ancient monasteries of the Tur Abdin in southeastern Turkey, Mor Gabriel, founded in 397 AD, still functioning. The oldest continuously inhabited Christian monastery in the world still stand. The liturgy still sounds. The flame, however diminished, still burns. The intellectual contribution of the Syriac tradition to human civilization, the preservation of ancient knowledge, the transmission across civilizational boundaries, the extraordinary translation work that made the Islamic Golden Age and ultimately the European Renaissance possible is one of history's great and underappreciated stories. It is a story of a people who did not conquer, who did not build armies, who did not rule empires. They built schools, they trained translators, they preserved texts, and through those texts, they preserved the capacity of the human mind to think across the ruptures of empire, religion, and time. See you in the past.